Some people like taking real close-ups of things, and if you're taking a real close-up, sometimes that's called macro photography. So we're going to have a go at that now. And we're going to choose something very simple for our subject, which is this leaf. So the first thing to consider when you've got your subject is, well, what sort of background are you going to put it on? Are you going to leave it where you actually found it? In this case, we found it surrounded by lots of other leaves in untidy grass. Or are we going to try and find a background that's complementary? And in this case, we've come across this branch here, and it's quite nice because it's a dark colour, so it'll set off the golden colours in the leaf, but also the texture is quite interesting as well. So we're going to find a way we can actually place this on the leaf, probably somewhere across there, and already it's starting to take on a subject of its own. We still need to decide how we're going to frame it and how we're going to photograph it, but it's now the subject that we actually want. It's nice and colourful, it's got a simple background, it's a simple subject. Now the way I'm going to photograph this is not with a macro lens. I'll assume that most people have got a telephoto lens, so I'm going to use a 70-200 lens. I'm going to put an extension tube behind it so that I can focus in really, really close. I'll put the camera on the tripod so I don't need to worry about camera shake. I'm going to use a cable release to trigger the shutter so that actually pressing the button is not going to create any vibrations, and then we'll experiment and see how many different pictures we can get out of this one subject. One of the things that we will have to be careful of here is something called depth of field. Now the depth of field is how much of the subject is in focus from front to back. This subject's not too bad because it's fairly flat, but in some circumstances you might want what's called a large depth of field, where it's very sharp from close to the camera to quite a long distance away. You control that on your camera by using the aperture setting. As a starting point for this particular subject, I'm going to try and get the back of the camera so that it's parallel to the subject, so that I don't need to use a large depth of field, although I'll probably start on f11. This camera's great because it's got a little button on the side just down here, which is called the depth of field preview button, and when you press that button the camera will actually show you what the depth of field is. It will show you how much of the subject is in focus, and that can be a really useful tool so that we can see what the depth of field is going to be, what the focus is going to be before we take the subject. I actually find that the screen on the back of a digital camera is just as good a tool, because you can actually see the whole subject and you can also see the depth of field. So there are two tools that we can use: the depth of field button and the sensor screen on the back. So we'll set up and then we'll come back to you and we'll show you what subjects we've got. Okay, so we've got a setup here. There's a leaf that we've found and we've decided to put it on this log because it makes a nice background. We've set the camera up. On this occasion we're going to use a 70-200mm zoom. We don't need any extra accessories with this. We could, if we want, use an extension tube which would let the lens focus closer, or if we had one we could use a screw-in diopter that would go on the front of the lens. But on this occasion, because the subject is reasonably large, we don't need any of those accessories. We're on a good firm tripod, so we're not going to have any problems with camera shake. It also gives us the opportunity to really stop down for plenty of depth of field. And on this occasion, because nothing is moving, the leaf isn't moving, the branch isn't moving, nor the camera, I'm going to use f16. I could probably get away with less, but I'm going to err on the side of caution. One thing that you do need to be careful of when you're using such a slow shutter speed is that inside this sort of camera, which is an SLR camera, there's a mirror, and when the mirror flaps up it causes vibrations. It takes a 1/15 of a second for the vibration to travel down the length of the lens and back. So if you have a shutter time of a 1/15 of a second, your camera is going to be vibrating due to the mirror for the whole of that time. You can get around that problem. Some cameras have got what they call a mirror lockup. This camera's got that function, so if I press the button once, the mirror gets locked up, I can let the vibrations die down and then press the button again to take the photograph. If you've got a camera that doesn't have a mirror lockup facility, there is a really neat workaround. Remember we said that the vibration takes a 1/15 of a second to travel along the lens? If you set your camera up with an even smaller aperture and a much slower shutter speed, that vibration still takes a 1/15 of a second to travel down the lens. But if you've got an exposure time of 1 second, most of that exposure time the camera will be still. Only a 15th of a second will be vibrating. So you can actually get a sharper picture by shooting at a slower shutter speed. It sounds strange, but it works. The other alternative is actually having a beanbag and placing a beanbag on top of your camera, and that will allow the vibrations to die down. So that's the kit that we're actually using on the tripod itself to take this picture. We're now going to go in close and show you how we can manipulate this subject by playing around with the light. We've got the situation here now where the light is coming from behind and it's just backlighting the leaf here really quite beautifully. But that isn't allowing the front part of the leaf to really show up. So we're going to bounce some light back in, and there's a number of ways in which we can do that. We could actually use a white reflector. Here I've got a white reflector. It's just a piece of fabric on a wire hoop. And if I move the reflector in, you can see that it's got a very gentle effect in bouncing that light back in. For this particular subject, I don't think that's quite strong enough. So if we want a stronger light, we can actually use a silver reflector. This is a Lasterlight reflector. And if I bring the reflector in, you'll see how it starts to light up the subject. But in this particular case, the subject is very warm and we want to try and communicate that warmth in the photograph. So finally we're going to experiment with a gold reflector. And obviously that's going to warm the light up that we're bouncing back onto the subject. And you can see the effect that that's having. So reflectors can really help control the light for you to make the best of any photographic situation. This is a very shiny leaf, and you might be able to see that just here and here it's starting to bleach out a little bit because of the shininess of the leaf. We can actually use our white reflector to stop that happening by putting it between the light source, in this case it's the cloud, and the subject, and you'll see that we're now controlling that reflection. That highlight is now controlled. The difficulty is that we're blocking some of the light, so we need to bounce it back into the subject. So I'm going to bring the gold reflector back in, and that should warm up the subject, and we should end up with a very controlled photograph.